The candle in Alexander Grant's study had burned down to a stub, and still his father's letter sat open on the desk, the wax seal broken, the words inside impossible to unread. Marry Alina Ashford within the year, or lose everything your family has built. Alexander read it a third time, his jaw tight, his hands cold despite the fire crackling nearby. He was not a man who frightened easily, but the thought of binding his life to a stranger, a woman he had never met, made his chest feel like it was being squeezed by an iron fist. He had heard the stories about her. Servants who traveled between estates carried gossip the way birds carried seeds, scattering it everywhere they landed. Alina Ashford, they said, was proud beyond reason, cold to anyone beneath her station, and interested only in the size of a man's fortune. One story claimed she had dismissed a maid for spilling tea on her glove. Another claimed she refused to speak to tenants who came to her family's door asking for help during a hard winter. Alexander did not know which stories were true and which were exaggerated by jealous tongues, but he knew he could not walk into a marriage blind, not when his family's future depended on it. So he made a decision that night, one that would have scandalized every person he knew if they had heard it spoken aloud. He would go to the Ashford estate not as a duke, but as a servant. He would take a false name, wear rough clothes, and work among the stable hands until he understood exactly who Alina Ashford truly was, long before she ever knew who he truly was. His valet, a steady man named Oliver who had served the Grant family since Alexander was a boy, tried to talk him out of it. "Your Grace, if anyone discovers this, the shame will follow you for the rest of your life," Oliver warned, packing the length of the study with his hands clasped behind his back. "And if I marry a woman I do not know, and she turns out to be everything the rumors say, what shame will that bring instead?" Alexander answered. "I would rather risk embarrassment now than misery for the rest of my days." Oliver said nothing more, though his frown remained fixed for the rest of the evening. 3 days later, Alexander rode out from his family's estate dressed not in fine wool and polished boots, but in a coarse brown coat borrowed from one of his own stable workers. He carried no title, no seal, no letters of introduction. He called himself Tom, a name plain enough to disappear into any crowd. His plan was simple. He would arrive at the Ashford estate, present himself as a traveling worker seeking employment, and take whatever position was offered, no matter how humble. The ride took most of the day, and by the time the Ashford estate came into view, the sky had turned a deep orange, the sun sinking behind rolling green hills dotted with grazing sheep. The main house stood tall and elegant, built from pale stone, with tall windows that caught the last light of the day. Alexander felt a strange tightening in his stomach as he approached, not because of the house itself, but because somewhere inside those walls was the woman who would decide the fate of his family, without ever knowing his true name. He dismounted near the stables, a long, low building set apart from the main house, and was met by an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. This was Ben, the stable master, who looked Alexander up and down with the practiced gaze of someone who had hired dozens of workers over the years. "You looking for work, boy?" Ben asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yes, sir," Alexander said, forcing his voice into a rougher, more common tone than the one he used at home. "I can handle horses. I am strong and I do not complain." Ben studied him a moment longer, then shrugged. "We lost a stable hand last month to a fever. If you can prove yourself by morning, you can stay. Bunk with the others in the back room. Pay is small, but there's food and a roof." "That is all I ask," Alexander said, and meant it more than Ben could have known. That first night, Alexander lay on a narrow cot in a room shared with 3 other stable workers, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of snoring and shifting straw, the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the walls. He thought of his own bed at home, soft and wide, and felt an odd mixture of discomfort and clarity. Here, stripped of his title, he was simply a man among men, judged only by the work of his hands. It was uncomfortable. It was also, in a strange way, freeing. The next morning began before the sun had fully risen. Alexander was shaken awake by one of the other workers, a cheerful young man named Peter, who tossed him a set of tools and told him to muck out the stalls before breakfast. Alexander had never done such labor in his life, and his arms ached within the first hour, his palms blistering against the handle of the pitchfork. He gritted his teeth and kept working, refusing to give Ben any reason to send him away before he had even glimpsed Alina Ashford. It was nearly noon when he first saw her. He had just finished leading a pair of horses out to the paddock when a figure appeared at the edge of the garden path, walking briskly, her skirts gathered in one hand to keep them from dragging in the dirt. She wore a simple gray dress, far plainer than Alexander expected of a lady rumored to care so deeply for wealth and appearances. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping around her face, and she carried a basket covered with a cloth. Alexander watched, curious despite himself, as she walked not toward the main house, but toward a cluster of small cottages beyond the orchard, the homes of the estate's tenant farmers. He set down his tools and followed at a distance, careful to stay unseen, telling himself it was simply the duty of a new worker to learn the layout of the land. What he witnessed over the following half hour did not match a single story he had heard. The young woman, who he would soon learn was indeed Alina Ashford herself, knocked gently on the door of the smallest cottage and was welcomed inside by an elderly woman whose hands trembled with age. Alexander crept close enough to see through a gap in the shutters. Inside, Alina knelt beside a narrow bed where a young boy lay sick with fever, his face pale, his breathing shallow. She placed the basket on the table, unpacking bread, broth, and a small bundle of herbs, speaking softly to the boy's grandmother the entire time. "The physician says the fever should break within 3 days," Alina said, her voice warm and steady. "I will come again tomorrow to check on him. If he grows worse before then, send word to the house immediately, day or night, and I will come." The grandmother thanked her, tears in her eyes, and Alina took the woman's trembling hands in her own, holding them a moment before rising to leave. Alexander stepped back quickly, pressing himself against the side of the cottage, his heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of being caught. This was not the cold, cruel woman the rumors described. This was someone who rose before dawn to bring food and medicine to a sick child, who spoke to a poor grandmother with the same gentleness a person might offer a close friend. Alexander did not know what to make of the contradiction, and he found himself wanting, more than anything, to understand which version of Alina Ashford was real. Over the following days, he kept his distance but watched closely, taking every opportunity his stable duties allowed to observe her without drawing attention. He learned that she rose early each morning, often before the rest of the household, and that she preferred walking to being driven whenever the weather allowed. He learned that the servants who worked closest to her, the ones who might have reason to resent a demanding mistress, instead spoke of her with quiet affection. One maid mentioned that Alina had mended her own torn dress rather than ask for help, saying she did not wish to add to anyone's workload during a busy week. Another servant recalled how Alina had given her own warm cloak to a shivering kitchen girl during a cold spell, wearing only a thin shawl herself for the rest of that bitter month. None of it matched the whispers that had reached Alexander's ears before he ever set foot on this land. It was on the 5th day that Alexander finally spoke to her directly, though not by any plan of his own. He had been sent to deliver a message to the head gardener near the eastern hedges, and as he crossed the lawn, he nearly collided with Alina herself, who was hurrying in the opposite direction, her arms full of cut flowers destined for the dinner table. "Oh," she gasped, stumbling slightly, and Alexander reached out instinctively to steady her, catching her elbow before she could drop the flowers entirely. "Careful there," he said, his voice still carrying the rougher accent he had practiced. Alina looked up at him, and for a moment Alexander forgot every reason he had come to this estate. Her eyes were a clear, warm brown, and there was an openness in her expression that seemed entirely unguarded, entirely honest. "Thank you," she said, straightening the flowers in her arms. "I was not looking where I was going. I never do when I am thinking too hard." "What were you thinking about?" Alexander asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too forward for a stable hand to ask a lady of the house. But Alina did not seem to mind. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with open curiosity. "You are new here," she said, rather than answered his question. "I have not seen you before." "Started 5 days ago," Alexander confirmed. "Name is Tom." "Tom," Alina repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Well, Tom, I was thinking about a wedding I do not wish to attend, though I fear I have no choice in the matter." Alexander's stomach dropped, though he kept his face carefully blank. "A wedding of your own, miss." Alina let out a short laugh that held little humor in it. "Unfortunately, yes. I am to marry a duke I have never met, a man my father assures me is respectable and wealthy, which seems to be all that matters to everyone except me." She shifted the flowers in her arms, glancing toward the house as though someone might overhear her even here in the open garden. "I imagine he is cold and distant, the way most men of his rank tend to be. Concerned only with appearances and fortune, the way I have been told I am concerned only with such things myself, which could not be further from the truth." Alexander felt the words land somewhere deep in his chest, sharper than he expected. This was how she saw him, or rather, how she saw the man she believed him to be, without ever having met the real Alexander at all. He wanted, quite suddenly and quite desperately, to tell her that he was not cold, that he was not distant, that the rumors about her had proven just as wrong as the rumors about him likely were. But he could say none of it without revealing everything. "Perhaps he will surprise you," Alexander said instead, choosing his words carefully. "People are not always what others say they are." Alina studied him a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Perhaps," she said softly, "though I have little reason to hope for it." She thanked him again for catching her flowers, then continued on her way toward the house, leaving Alexander standing alone on the lawn, his pulse still unsteady, his mind turning over everything he had just heard. He had come to this estate to learn the truth about the woman he was meant to marry. He had not expected that truth to feel so complicated, or that a single conversation could leave him wanting so badly to know more. As he walked back toward the stables, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the hills, Alexander understood one thing with complete certainty. Whatever happened next, he could not simply ride away and report back to his father that the rumors were false. He needed to know Alina Ashford properly, not as a duke evaluating a potential bride from a careful distance, but as Tom, the stable hand who had somehow, in the span of a single conversation, become genuinely curious about the woman behind the whispers. He did not yet know how deeply that curiosity would grow, or how difficult it would become to remember that his own name was a lie waiting to unravel. 2 weeks passed, and Alexander found himself waking each morning with a strange eagerness he had never felt at his own estate, where every day looked much like the one before it. Here, disguised as Tom, every day held the possibility of seeing Alina again, of learning something new about the woman his family's fortune depended on marrying. Their conversations became a quiet habit, though neither of them spoke of it openly. Alina often walked past the stables on her way to visit tenants, and Alexander made certain his duties kept him nearby whenever she did. Sometimes they spoke for only a minute, exchanging a greeting and little else. Other times, when no one else was near enough to notice, their talk stretched into a quarter hour or longer, Alina leaning against the paddock fence while Alexander worked, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm neither had expected. She told him about her mother, who had died when Alina was 12, leaving her to be raised largely by servants, and a father too consumed by business matters to notice his daughter growing into a woman. She told him about the tenants she visited, how she had begun the practice as a young girl simply because she disliked being alone in the great house, and how it had grown into something she could not imagine giving up, even after her marriage. "What will happen to the tenants once you marry the Duke?" Alexander asked one afternoon, watching her carefully as he brushed down a chestnut mare. Eleanor's expression flickered, something like worry crossing her features before she composed herself. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have heard he keeps a large household far from here. I suppose I will have little choice but to leave all of this behind, the tenants, the cottages, everything I have built these past years." She paused, running her fingers along the top rail of the fence. "It feels foolish to grieve something that has not yet happened, but I cannot help it." Alexander set down his brush, wanting badly to tell her that she need not give up any of it, that whatever home they built together could include the people she cared for. But he caught himself before the words escaped, remembering that Tom the stable hand had no authority to promise such things, and Alexander the Duke had not yet earned the right to make promises to a woman who did not know his true face. "Perhaps he is not as unreasonable as you fear," he said instead. Eleanor gave him a small, sad smile. "You keep saying that, Tom. I begin to wonder if you know something about dukes that I do not." Alexander felt his pulse quicken at how close her words came to the truth, but he only shrugged and returned to his work, grateful when a call from Ben pulled him away before he could say something he would regret. As the days passed, Alexander noticed something he had not expected to find within himself, a growing discomfort with the deception he had built. It was one thing to observe Eleanor from a distance, gathering evidence to prove or disprove the rumors that had reached his father's estate. It was another thing entirely to sit beside her in the evening shade, listening to her laugh at some small joke he had made, watching her eyes brighten when she spoke about the people she cared for, and knowing that every moment of trust she placed in him was built on a foundation of lies. He began to understand with growing unease that he was not merely testing Eleanor. He was falling for her, and she had no idea the man she was falling for and the man she dreaded marrying were the very same person. One evening, as autumn winds began to strip the last golden leaves from the orchard trees, Eleanor found Alexander sitting alone on an overturned crate near the stable entrance, staring out at the darkening fields. She approached quietly, settling herself on a nearby bench without waiting for an invitation, something she had grown comfortable enough to do in recent weeks. "You look troubled tonight," she observed. Alexander considered lying, considered brushing off her concern with some easy excuse, but something in her steady gaze made him want to speak honestly, even if he could not tell her the whole truth. "I am thinking about choices," he said slowly, "about decisions that seemed simple when I made them, but have grown more complicated than I expected." "That sounds rather serious for a stable hand," Eleanor said, though her tone held no mockery, only genuine curiosity. "Perhaps I am not as simple as I appear," Alexander answered, and immediately regretted how close the words cut to the truth. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, and Alexander wondered if she could somehow sense the weight of everything he was hiding. But instead of pressing further, she simply nodded, as though accepting that some things were not meant to be explained fully, at least not yet. "I have been thinking about choices too," she admitted after a pause. "Everyone assumes I dread this marriage because I am selfish, because I care only for my own comfort and freedom, but that is not why I fear it at all." She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "I fear becoming a stranger to myself. I fear that whoever this Duke turns out to be, he will expect a wife who exists only to please him, who abandons everything she has built here without a second thought, simply because a marriage contract says she must." "And if he did not expect that," Alexander asked quietly, "if he wished for you to remain exactly who you are, tenants and cottages and all?" Eleanor turned to look at him fully then, something searching in her expression. "Then perhaps I would not fear the marriage nearly so much," she said softly. "But Tom, I have learned not to hope for things that seem too good to be believed. Hope of that kind only leads to disappointment." They sat together in silence for a while after that, the last light fading from the sky, and Alexander felt the full weight of his deception pressing down on him more heavily than ever before. He wanted, with an intensity that surprised him, to reach across the space between them and tell her everything. To confess his true name, his true title, and the plan that had brought him here in the first place. But he feared what her reaction would be, feared that she would see the disguise not as an attempt to know her honestly, but as a cruel trick played at her expense. So he said nothing, and the moment passed, and Alina eventually rose and bid him good night, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his careful plan had spun far beyond his control. Word of Alina's kindness toward the stable hand named Tom had not gone entirely unnoticed among the other servants. Charlotte, a young woman who served as Alina's personal maid and closest companion, mentioned it to Alina directly one morning while helping her dress for the day. "You spend a great deal of time speaking with the new stable hand," Charlotte observed, her tone light but her eyes curious as she fastened the buttons along Alina's sleeve. "He is easy to talk to," Alina said simply, though a faint color rose in her cheeks. Charlotte smiled knowingly but said nothing further, and Alina was grateful for her friend's discretion, though she could not entirely explain, even to herself, why her conversations with Tom had come to matter so much to her in recent weeks. She told herself it was simply loneliness, the natural result of facing an uncertain future with no one to confide in who truly understood her fears. But some quieter part of her suspected the truth ran deeper than mere loneliness, and that suspicion frightened her nearly as much as the marriage itself. Meanwhile, Alexander received a letter from Oliver, delivered discreetly through a contact in the nearby village, urging him to conclude his investigation and return home before his prolonged absence raised questions his father could not easily explain away. Alexander read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat, unable to shake the feeling that returning home now, with everything still unresolved between himself and Alina, would leave a wound neither of them could easily heal. He decided to stay a little longer, telling himself he needed more time to be certain of his findings, though he knew, deep down, that certainty was not truly what kept him rooted to this estate. It was Alina herself, and the growing fear that once his disguise ended, whatever they had built together might end with it. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to the Ashford estate, a distant cousin of Lord Ashford's named Gerald Fenwick, who arrived with little warning and even less patience for the household's routines. Gerald had attended several society gatherings in the capital over the years, gatherings where Alexander himself, in his true identity, had occasionally appeared. Alexander did his best to avoid crossing paths with the man, keeping to the stables and avoiding the main house whenever Gerald was said to be nearby. But the estate was not so large that two men could avoid each other indefinitely. Their first encounter came by accident, in the courtyard near the carriage house, where Alexander was leading a horse toward the stables just as Gerald emerged from the main entrance, deep in conversation with Lord Ashford about matters of business. Gerald's eyes passed over Alexander briefly, the way a person's gaze might sweep across any servant without truly seeing them, and for a moment Alexander believed he had escaped notice entirely. But then Gerald paused mid-sentence, his expression shifting into something between confusion and recognition, his eyes narrowing as he studied Alexander's face more closely. "Forgive me," Gerald said slowly, addressing Alexander directly despite Lord Ashford's evident surprise at the interruption. "Have we met before? You bear a striking resemblance to someone I once encountered in the capital." Alexander felt his pulse spike, but he kept his expression carefully neutral, bowing his head slightly in the manner expected of a servant. "I could not say, sir. I have never traveled to the capital myself." Gerald continued studying him a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, though he said nothing further before Lord Ashford steered the conversation back toward business matters, and the two men moved on toward the house. Alexander exhaled slowly once they were out of sight, his hands trembling slightly as he led the horse the rest of the way to its stall, aware that the fragile disguise he had built over the past weeks had just come dangerously close to collapsing entirely. He knew, with growing certainty, that time was no longer on his side. Whatever remained unspoken between himself and Alina would need to be resolved soon, before Gerald's suspicion hardened into certainty, and before the truth came out in a way that Alexander could no longer control. That night, unable to sleep, Alexander walked the length of the stable yard beneath a sky thick with stars, turning over every possible way to tell Alina the truth without losing everything he had built with her. He thought of her warmth, her honesty, the quiet trust she had extended to a man she believed to be nothing more than a humble stable hand. He thought of how she had spoken of dreading a marriage to a cold, distant duke, never suspecting that the very man she feared and the man she had come to trust were one and the same. He did not yet know how he would tell her, or when, but he understood, standing alone beneath that vast dark sky, that the choice would not remain his for much longer. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, the truth was already stirring, waiting for the moment it would break free and change everything between them. The morning after Gerald Fenwick's unsettling encounter with Alexander, the estate buzzed with preparations for a harvest gathering that Lord Ashford held every year to thank the tenants and workers for their labor through the growing season. Long tables were carried out onto the lawn, garlands of autumn leaves and late flowers were strung between the trees, and the kitchen staff worked from dawn preparing enough food to feed the entire estate. Alexander had hoped the chaos of preparation might keep him far from Gerald's watchful eyes, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. Ben assigned him to help set up the long tables near the orchard, a task that placed him directly in view of the main house and anyone who might step outside to observe the proceedings. Alexander worked quickly, keeping his head down, grateful when the job was finished without incident. He allowed himself to relax only once he had returned to the relative safety of the stables, brushing down the horses that would later pull the carriages of any guests arriving for the evening's festivities. It was there that Alina found him, slipping away from her own preparations for a few stolen minutes before the gathering began in earnest. "You look tired," she said, leaning against the stall door watching him work. "Busy season," Alexander replied, forcing a smile. "Your father's gathering is no small undertaking." "He does this every year," Alina said, a note of fondness creeping into her voice despite the exhaustion in her own eyes. "He says it is the least he can do for the people who make this estate what it is. I think, in truth, he simply enjoys an excuse for music and dancing, though he would never admit such a thing." Alexander laughed, genuinely this time, and Alina's answering smile eased some of the tension that had settled into his shoulders since his encounter with Gerald the previous day. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget the danger circling closer with each passing hour, focusing instead on the simple pleasure of her company. "Will you attend tonight?" Alina asked, then seemed to catch herself, color rising in her cheeks. "I only mean the workers are welcome to join once the formal dinner concludes. There will be music in the courtyard and dancing for anyone who wishes it." "I had not planned on it," Alexander admitted, though something in her question made him reconsider. "I am not much of a dancer." "Neither am I, if I am honest," Alina said, laughing softly. "But I find I would rather stumble through a dance with someone I actually enjoy speaking to than stand gracefully beside guests who only wish to discuss my upcoming marriage as though I were a prize to be evaluated." Alexander felt something warm and dangerous unfurl in his chest at her words, a hope he knew he had no right to entertain. "Then perhaps I will find my way to the courtyard tonight, if only to save you from an evening of tiresome company." Alina's smile widened, and she left him with a lightness in her step that Alexander could not help but notice, and could not help but feel responsible for, in a way that filled him with both joy and dread in equal measure. The formal dinner that evening was, as expected, an affair Alexander observed only from a careful distance, watching through the tall windows as Lord Ashford's guests dined on the finest food the estate's kitchens could produce. Gerald sat near the head of the table, engaged in conversation with several other guests, and Alexander made certain to keep well out of view, unwilling to risk another encounter that might reignite the man's suspicions. Once the formal dinner concluded, and the guests moved toward the courtyard for music and dancing, the atmosphere of the estate shifted entirely. Servants and workers who had spent weeks preparing for the gathering were finally permitted to enjoy some measure of the festivities themselves, and the courtyard filled with a warmer, less formal energy as musicians struck up lively tunes and lanterns were lit along the garden paths. Alexander found Alina near the edge of the courtyard, half hidden in the shadow of a large oak tree, watching the dancers with an expression that mixed longing and resignation. She had changed from her earlier practical dress into something more suited to the evening, a soft blue gown that caught the lantern light beautifully, though Alexander noticed she had chosen simplicity over the elaborate styles favored by the other ladies present. "You came," she said, brightening as he approached. "I said I would," Alexander replied, "though I fear I will make good on my earlier warning about my dancing abilities." "I shall risk it," Alina said, extending her hand toward him with a boldness that surprised them both. They moved together toward the edge of the dancing crowd, close enough to the shadows that they remained largely unnoticed by the more prominent guests near the center of the courtyard. Alexander was, in truth, not entirely unskilled at dancing, having been trained in his youth as befitted his true rank, but he deliberately softened his movements, stumbling slightly here and there to maintain the illusion of a stable hand unused to such refined activity. Alina laughed each time he missed a step, and Alexander found he did not mind the small deception if it meant hearing that particular sound again and again. For a while, spinning slowly beneath the lantern light, surrounded by music and laughter, Alexander allowed himself to forget entirely who he was pretending to be, and who he truly was, and the impossible distance between those two truths. There was only Alina, her hand warm in his, her eyes bright with an ease he had not seen in her since their very first conversation weeks earlier. "I have not felt this happy in a long while," Alina admitted quietly, as the music slowed into something gentler. "I did not expect to find such happiness here, of all places, on the eve of preparing for a marriage I have dreaded for months." Alexander's chest tightened at her words, torn between the joy of hearing them and the guilt of knowing how much remained unspoken between them. "Perhaps happiness finds us in unexpected places precisely because we stop searching so hard for it," he said softly. Alina looked up at him then, something searching and vulnerable in her expression. "Tom, I must ask you something, and I hope you will answer honestly." Alexander's heart lurched, certain the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. "Ask me anything." "Do you think it is foolish?" Alina began slowly. "For a woman in my position to wish that the man she is bound to marry might somehow turn out to be someone she could genuinely care for, rather than merely tolerate for the sake of duty?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning neither of them dared to name directly. Alexander wanted desperately to tell her the truth in that very moment, to confess that the Duke she dreaded and the man standing before her were the same person, and that he had come to care for her more deeply than he had ever expected. But the fear of losing everything they had built together in an instant of unwelcome revelation held his tongue captive. "I do not think it foolish at all," he said instead, his voice rougher than he intended. "I think it is the most natural wish in the world." Alina studied his face for a long moment, as though searching for something just beyond his words, some deeper truth she could not quite grasp. But before she could press further, A commotion near the main house drew both their attention, voices raised in urgency, and a servant came rushing across the lawn calling for Alina by name. "Miss Ashford, please. It is the Henderson boy. His fever has worsened terribly. His grandmother sent for you at once." Alina's expression shifted instantly from tender curiosity to focused concern, and she released Alexander's hand without hesitation. "I must go to him," she said, already moving toward the servant. She paused only a moment, glancing back at Alexander with an expression he could not quite decipher. "Will you come with me? I may need help carrying supplies, and I do not wish to waste time explaining the situation to someone unfamiliar with the family." Alexander did not hesitate, following her swiftly across the darkened lawn toward the small cluster of tenant cottages, his heart pounding with a mixture of concern for the sick child and a strange, fierce pride at being trusted so completely by the woman he had come to care for so deeply. They found the Henderson cottage in a state of quiet panic, the boy's grandmother wringing her hands beside his bed, while the child himself tossed restlessly beneath a thin blanket, his small face flushed and damp with sweat. Alina knelt immediately beside the bed, pressing the back of her hand against the boy's forehead, her expression grave. "We need cool water and clean cloths," she said firmly, glancing up at Alexander. "And send someone for the physician immediately, regardless of the hour." Alexander moved without question, fetching water from the well behind the cottage, while another servant was dispatched to rouse the physician from his home in the nearby village. Over the following hours, Alexander watched Alina work with a steady, practiced calm that revealed just how many times she must have sat at bedsides like this one before, tending to those the wealthy and powerful so often overlooked entirely. She pressed cool cloths against the boy's forehead, spoke to him in a low, soothing voice even as he drifted in and out of feverish sleep, and never once complained about the late hour or the fine gown now stained with water and worry. Alexander found himself watching her not as a duke evaluating a potential wife, nor even entirely as Tom the stable hand infatuated with a woman above his station, but simply as a man witnessing genuine goodness, uncomplicated by rumor or expectation. The physician arrived just past midnight, examined the boy carefully, and pronounced that the fever, while serious, showed signs of finally breaking. He left instructions for continued care and departed with a promise to return by morning. Alina remained at the boy's bedside until his breathing evened into a more peaceful rhythm, only then allowing herself to be led gently outside by Alexander, who had waited nearby the entire time. "You saved his life tonight," Alexander said quietly, as they walked slowly back toward the main house beneath a sky just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. "I only did what anyone would do," Alina said, though exhaustion had softened her voice considerably. "Not everyone would abandon a celebration in their own honor to sit through the night at a sick child's bedside," Alexander countered gently. "You are not what the rumors say about you, Alina. You are not cold or selfish or concerned only with wealth and appearances. I do not understand how anyone could look at you and believe such things." Alina stopped walking, turning to face him fully in the pale, early light. "You truly believe that?" "I know it," Alexander said, and the certainty in his voice surprised them both. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither dared name aloud. Alina reached up slowly, brushing her fingers against his jaw in a gesture so tender and unguarded that Alexander felt his careful composure begin to crumble entirely. "I do not know what it is about you, Tom," she whispered, "but I find myself dreading the thought of a marriage that will take me away from this place, away from these people, and yes, away from you more than I have ever dreaded anything in my life." Alexander closed his eyes briefly, torn between the overwhelming urge to confess everything and the paralyzing fear of what that confession might cost him. When he opened them again, he found Alina watching him with an expression of such open trust that the weight of his deception felt suddenly unbearable. "Alina," he began, his voice unsteady. "There is something I must tell you, something I should have told you long ago." But before he could continue, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them, and both turned to see Charlotte hurrying across the lawn, her expression tight with concern. "Miss Ashford, you must come quickly," Charlotte said breathlessly. "Mr. Fenwick has been asking questions about the new stable hand all evening, and I fear he suspects something troubling. He has requested an audience with your father first thing this morning to discuss the matter." Aline's brow furrowed in confusion, glancing between Charlotte and Alexander, clearly sensing that something significant was unfolding just beyond her understanding. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him, the careful balance he had maintained for weeks finally beginning to tip toward collapse. What could Mr. Fenwick possibly suspect about a stable hand? Aline asked, though something in her tone suggested she already sensed the answer would change everything between them. Alexander said nothing, his silence stretching long enough that Aline's confusion slowly began to shift into something far more troubled, and far closer to the truth than either of them was prepared for in that fragile, uncertain dawn. The silence between them stretched unbearably, broken only by the distant call of a rooster somewhere across the estate, announcing the arrival of morning. Aline's eyes searched Alexander's face, and he watched the confusion in her expression slowly give way to something sharper, more suspicious, as though pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling suddenly began sliding into place. "Tom," she said slowly, "why would a cousin of my father's have any interest at all in a stable hand?" Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it again, torn between the truth and the fragile hope that he might yet find a gentler way to reveal it. But Charlotte's presence, and the urgency in her voice moments earlier, had already shattered whatever careful timing he had hoped to control. "There is something I need to explain," Alexander finally said, his voice low. "It is not simple, and I fear you will not receive it well, but you deserve to hear it from me, and not from Gerald Fenwick or anyone else." Aline crossed her arms, a defensive posture Alexander had never seen her adopt before, not once in all their weeks of easy conversation. "Then explain it." "My name is not Tom," Alexander said, forcing the words out before his courage could fail him entirely. "My name is Alexander Grant. I am the Duke of Ravensworth." For a moment, Aline simply stared at him, as though the words had not fully registered, as though her mind refused to accept what her ears had clearly heard. Then, slowly, understanding dawned across her features, followed swiftly by a look of such raw betrayal that Alexander felt it like a physical blow. "You," she whispered, stepping back from him as though his very presence had become something dangerous. "You are the Duke, the man I am to marry. You have been here this entire time, pretending to be a stable hand, listening to me speak about how much I dreaded meeting him, dreaded meeting you, and you said nothing." "Aline, please let me explain." "Explain what exactly?" Aline's voice rose, sharp with anger and hurt in equal measure. "That you thought so little of me, so little of my judgment, that you needed to trick me into revealing my true self before you would consider marrying me. That you sat beside me at that sick child's bed, held my hand while we danced, listened to me confess my fears about our marriage, all while laughing privately at how easily I was deceived." "I never laughed at you," Alexander said desperately, reaching toward her, though she pulled away before he could touch her. "Aline, I came here because I heard terrible rumors about you, rumors that painted you as cold and cruel, and I could not bring myself to marry a stranger based on gossip alone. I needed to see the truth for myself." "And did you find it convenient," Aline said, her voice trembling now, "that the truth turned out to be so very different from what you expected? Did it please you, watching me unknowingly reveal every private fear and hope, while you stood there in your borrowed coat, gathering evidence like some kind of judge weighing my worth?" "That is not how it happened," Alexander insisted, though even as he spoke the words, He understood how thoroughly his actions could be read exactly as she described them. "I did not intend to deceive you for so long. I intended only to observe from a distance, but then I began to know you, truly know you, and I could not bring myself to walk away. You could have told me the truth the moment you realized the rumors were false," Elinor said, tears now bright in her eyes, though her voice remained steady with anger. "You could have told me at any point over these past weeks. Instead, you let me believe I was falling for a humble, stable hand, when in truth I was simply being tested by the very man who held my future in his hands all along." Alexander felt the accusation land with devastating accuracy, for he could offer no defense against it that did not sound hollow even to his own ears. "You are right," he said quietly. "I should have told you sooner. I let my own fear of losing whatever we were building together keep me silent far longer than I should have allowed." "Fear," Elinor repeated bitterly. "You speak of fear as though I have not spent these past months living in fear of exactly this outcome, a marriage built on deception rather than honesty, a husband who would rather manipulate circumstances to his own advantage than simply trust me enough to be truthful from the very beginning." She turned away from him then, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, and Alexander could see her shoulders trembling, though whether from anger or heartbreak or some combination of both, he could not say for certain. "I need you to leave," Elinor said, her back still turned toward him. "I cannot look at you right now, Your Grace, and I certainly cannot continue speaking with you as though nothing has changed between us." "Elinor, please," she said, her voice cracking slightly on the single word, and Alexander understood that any further attempt to explain himself in this moment would only deepen the wound rather than begin to heal it. He stepped back, his chest aching with a grief he had not anticipated feeling so intensely, and watched as Elinor walked away from him across the lawn, her figure growing smaller in the pale morning light until she disappeared entirely into the main house. News of the Duke's true identity spread through the estate with remarkable speed, once Gerald Fenwick's suspicions were confirmed to Lord Ashford directly. By midday, every servant on the property knew that the humble stable hand named Tom had, in fact, been the very Duke Elinor had been promised to marry, and the household buzzed with a mixture of astonishment, amusement, and quiet concern for what the revelation might mean for the upcoming wedding. Lord Ashford summoned Alexander to his study that afternoon, his expression a careful mask of diplomatic neutrality that nonetheless failed to hide his evident displeasure at the elaborate deception that had unfolded beneath his own roof. "I must confess, Your Grace," Lord Ashford began, once Alexander had properly identified himself and offered what explanation he could, "I find myself uncertain whether to admire your resourcefulness or condemn your methods entirely. You have placed my daughter in a position of considerable embarrassment, and I fear the damage done to her trust may prove far more difficult to repair than any contract or arrangement between our families." "I understand your concern, my lord," Alexander said, standing straight despite the exhaustion weighing on him. "I acted foolishly in maintaining the deception as long as I did. I take full responsibility for the hurt I have caused your daughter, and I intend to make amends if she will permit me the opportunity." Lord Ashford studied him for a long moment, his expression softening slightly, though wariness remained evident in his eyes. "Elinor has always been strong-willed, more so than most young women of her station. If you truly wish to earn back her trust, empty apologies and grand gestures will not suffice. She will need to see, through your actions rather than your words, that you are capable of the same honesty you demanded from circumstance when you chose to deceive her in the first place." "I intend to prove exactly that, my lord," Alexander said firmly. "Whatever time it takes, whatever it requires of me, I will not abandon the effort to make things right between us." Lord Ashford nodded slowly, though he offered no further reassurance beyond permitting Alexander to remain on the estate grounds, while matters between himself and Elinor were resolved one way or another. Over the following days, Alexander attempted several times to speak with Alina, only to find every avenue firmly closed against him. She took her meals in her chambers rather than joining the household at the main table. She altered her daily routine entirely, visiting the tenant cottages at hours when she knew Alexander would be occupied elsewhere, and enlisting Charlotte to ensure she was never left alone in a location where he might approach her unexpectedly. Charlotte, though sympathetic to Alexander's evident regret, remained fiercely loyal to her mistress, offering him little comfort whenever their paths crossed. "She trusted you completely," Charlotte told him bluntly one afternoon, when Alexander had asked once again whether Alina might be willing to hear him out. "She confided things to you she has never spoken aloud to another living soul, myself included." To discover that trust was built on a foundation of deception, however well-intentioned, has wounded her far more deeply than you seem to understand, Your Grace. "I do understand," Alexander said, frustration and guilt warring within him in equal measure. "That is precisely why I cannot simply give up and return home, leaving things between us unresolved. She deserves better than that, and so, I hope, do I." Charlotte studied him a moment longer, something in her expression softening slightly despite her evident loyalty to Alina's wounded feelings. "If you truly mean that, Your Grace, then perhaps patience will accomplish what desperate pleading cannot. Alina needs time before she will be ready to hear anything you have to say, and pressing her too forcefully will only push her further away." Alexander took the advice to heart, though the following week tested his patience more severely than he had anticipated. He busied himself with estate matters that Lord Ashford, somewhat reluctantly, allowed him to assist with, hoping to demonstrate through practical usefulness that his character ran deeper than the elaborate ruse that had brought him to this household in the first place. He continued visiting the Henderson boy, whose fever had fully broken, bringing small gifts and checking on his continued recovery, though he did so now openly as himself, rather than hiding behind Tom's borrowed identity. Word of these quiet efforts eventually reached Alina, carried through the same servant gossip that had once spread rumors about her own supposed coldness. She heard, from more than one source, that the Duke had not returned home despite the evident tension his presence created, that he continued tending to the tenants he had first come to know as a humble stable hand, and that he asked after her welfare daily, though he never once attempted to force his way into her presence uninvited. Late one evening, nearly 2 weeks after the painful revelation in the garden, Alina found herself standing at her bedroom window, watching Alexander's distant figure moving among the stables in the fading light, still helping Ben with the evening duties despite having no obligation whatsoever to continue such menial labor. She thought of everything he had told her, and everything he had not told her, weighing the depth of his deception against the evident sincerity of his continued presence and effort. She did not yet know what she intended to do, or whether her wounded trust could ever be fully mended. But standing there in the quiet darkness of her chamber, she found herself, for the first time since the truth had shattered everything between them, wondering whether the man she had come to know as Tom, flawed and deceptive though his methods had been, might still be worth the risk of forgiveness. A letter arrived at Alexander's borrowed quarters near the stables on a cool morning, nearly 3 weeks after the truth had come between them, carried by Charlotte herself rather than any ordinary servant. Alexander recognized Alina's handwriting on the folded paper before he even broke the seal, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread as he unfolded it carefully. The note was brief, containing only a request that he meet her that afternoon in the orchard, at the exact spot where he had first followed her weeks earlier, when she had brought food and medicine to the Henderson family. Alexander read the words 3 times, searching for any hint of what awaited him, but Alina had given nothing else away, leaving him to spend the remaining hours before their meeting in a state of restless anticipation he had not felt since the earliest, most uncertain days of his deception. When the appointed hour arrived, Alexander made his way to the orchard beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain, the autumn air sharp and cold against his face. He found Alina already waiting beneath one of the largest apple trees, her figure wrapped in a warm cloak, her expression difficult to read in the dim afternoon light. "Thank you for coming," she said, as he approached, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of nervousness she could not entirely disguise. "I would have come regardless of the hour or the weather," Alexander said honestly. "I have hoped every day these past weeks that you might be willing to speak with me again." Alina was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts, and Alexander forced himself to wait patiently, remembering Charlotte's advice about the danger of pressing too hard against wounds still healing. "I have spent a great deal of time thinking about everything that happened," Alina finally said. "About the deception, and the anger I felt when I learned the truth, and whether that anger was entirely fair, given everything else that passed between us during those weeks." "You had every right to feel angry," Alexander said quietly. "What I did was wrong, regardless of my intentions. I should have trusted you with the truth far sooner than I did." "Yes," Alina agreed simply, without hesitation. "You should have. But Tom, or Alexander, I suppose I must learn to call you now, I find myself needing to confess something as well, something I have not admitted to anyone, not even to Charlotte, though she has certainly guessed at it." Alexander waited, his breath caught somewhere between hope and fear, uncertain what confession could possibly follow such a serious introduction. Alina took a slow breath, her eyes meeting his directly despite the vulnerability evident in her expression. "Long before you ever arrived at this estate, I had already heard whispers about the Duke I was promised to marry. Servants who travel between households carry gossip just as freely in one direction as the other, and the stories that reached me painted you as cold, arrogant, and entirely consumed with matters of status and wealth, indifferent to anything resembling genuine warmth or kindness." Alexander felt a strange, uncomfortable recognition settle over him, understanding suddenly that the rumors which had driven him to disguise himself in the first place had mirrored almost exactly the rumors Alina herself had endured about her own character. "I did not know that," he admitted quietly. "I did not tell you because admitting it felt like admitting how frightened I truly was," Alina continued. "But when I met you, when I came to know Tom the stable hand over these past weeks, I found myself hopping, quietly and almost against my own will, that perhaps the rumors about the Duke were as unfair and mistaken as the rumors that had been spread about me." She paused, a faint, almost embarrassed smile touching her lips. "I even remember thinking, more than once during our conversations, how much I wished the Duke I was destined to marry could somehow turn out to be someone exactly like you." Alexander stared at her, understanding slowly dawning as her meaning became clear. "You wished the Duke could be like Tom," he repeated softly, without ever suspecting that Tom and the Duke were the very same man. "Precisely," Alina said, her voice growing steadier now that the confession had begun. "I told myself it was a foolish, impossible wish, the kind of thing a person allows herself to imagine only because reality feels too disappointing to accept otherwise. I never dreamed the wish might actually be true, that the very man I had grown to trust and admire was, all along, the same man I feared meeting as my husband." "Alina," Alexander said, stepping closer, though he stopped himself before closing the distance entirely, unwilling to presume too much given how fragile their reconciliation still felt. "If I had known you carried such fears, such quiet hopes, I would have found a way to reveal myself far sooner. I never intended for my deception to cause you such prolonged pain." "I know that now," Alina said. "I have had time to consider your actions more fairly than I could in the anger of that first morning. You did not deceive me out of cruelty, or out of some desire to manipulate my feelings for your own advantage. You deceived me because, like myself, you had heard frightening rumors and needed to discover the truth for yourself before committing your entire future to a stranger." "That is exactly why I did it," Alexander confirmed. Though I understand now that the method I chose caused far more harm than I anticipated when I first devised the plan. Alina nodded slowly, then reached out, taking his hand in hers with a gentleness that made Alexander's chest tighten with cautious hope. I do not say any of this to excuse what you did entirely, she said. The deception still hurt me deeply, and I think it will take time before I fully trust that you will always choose honesty over convenient concealment in the future. But I find that my anger has softened considerably, especially once I understood that you were not testing me from some position of cold superiority, but were, in truth, just as frightened and uncertain as I was, searching for the very same reassurance I myself had quietly hoped to find. I will spend as long as it takes proving that you can trust me completely, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. I do not ask for your forgiveness immediately, only for the chance to earn it properly, through my actions rather than mere words. Alina studied him for a long moment, the wind stirring the branches above them, scattering a few remaining golden leaves across the grass between their feet. There is one more thing I must tell you, she said finally, and I fear it may leave you rather surprised. After everything else we have confessed to each other today, Alexander said, managing a small, uncertain smile, I believe I can withstand a bit more surprise. Alina's expression grew serious, though a warmth lingered beneath it that Alexander found himself desperately hoping to understand correctly. During these past weeks, watching you from a distance, hearing from Charlotte and even from my own father about your continued efforts here on the estate, your patience, your refusal to abandon the tenants you had come to know, your willingness to accept my anger without demanding I simply forgive you on your own timeline rather than mine, I came to a realization I did not expect. What realization? Alexander asked, his heart pounding. I realized, Alina said softly, that I had already fallen in love with you weeks ago, back when I believed you to be nothing more than a humble stable hand named Tom. And despite everything, despite the anger and the hurt and the betrayal I felt upon learning the truth, that love never actually disappeared. It simply had to make peace with the fact that the man I loved and the Duke I feared marrying were one and the same person all along. For a long moment, Alexander could find no words at all, standing beneath the apple tree with Alina's confession settling over him like the first warm sunlight after a long, bitter winter. He had come to this estate prepared to evaluate a potential bride based on rumor and reputation, never imagining he would find, instead, a woman whose honesty and courage in admitting her own vulnerable feelings left him utterly speechless, unable to summon any response adequate to the moment. Alina, he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion, I do not know that I deserve such honesty from you, given how poorly I handled my own truth these past weeks. But I want you to know that my feelings for you are exactly as genuine as everything I felt while pretending to be Tom. I did not perform affection for you as part of some elaborate strategy. Every moment we spent together, every conversation, every small kindness you showed me while believing me to be nothing more than a common worker, deepened feelings in me that have only grown stronger since learning the truth of who you truly are beneath every rumor and expectation placed upon you. Alina's eyes filled with tears, though her smile remained steady and true. Then perhaps, she said, we might consider beginning again properly this time without any disguises or hidden names standing between us. I would like nothing more, Alexander said, finally closing the distance between them entirely, reaching up to brush away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. They stood together beneath the apple tree as the first drops of rain began to fall, neither of them moving to seek shelter, both too consumed by the relief and joy of finding their way back to each other despite everything that had threatened to keep them apart. When Alexander finally spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that had been entirely absent during his uncertain arrival at this estate weeks earlier. I promise you this, he said. Whatever our life together holds, I will never again choose concealment over honesty, no matter how frightening the truth might feel in the moment. You deserve a husband who trusts you enough to share his fears and uncertainties directly, rather than hiding behind borrowed names and disguises." "And I promise," Alina replied, "that I will remember, whenever fear or doubt creeps into our marriage, that the man I fell in love with as a humble, stable hand and the Duke I am destined to marry are exactly the same person, flaws and all, and that this is a far greater gift than the empty perfection I once feared such a marriage would demand of me." Their wedding took place 2 months later, on a clear winter morning with frost glittering across the estate grounds, though the ceremony itself was held before a fire roaring warm and bright within the great hall. Every tenant Alina had cared for over the years attended as honored guests rather than distant observers, including the Henderson boy, now fully recovered and grinning widely from the front row beside his grateful grandmother. Ben the stable master stood proudly near the back, having grown genuinely fond of the young worker he once knew only as Tom, now watching him marry the woman both of them had come to admire so deeply during those strange, transformative weeks. Lord Ashford gave his daughter away with evident pride, his earlier reservations about Alexander's deceptive methods long since softened by witnessing the genuine devotion that had grown between the couple in the months since the truth first emerged between them. Charlotte stood beside Alina throughout the ceremony, her earlier fierce protectiveness now replaced entirely by quiet happiness for her dearest friend's evident joy. As Alexander and Alina exchanged their vows, promising honesty and partnership rather than mere duty and obligation, Alexander found himself thinking back to that first uncertain night, riding toward the Ashford estate in borrowed, rough clothing, prepared to judge a stranger's character from a careful, guarded distance. He had never imagined, setting out on that deceptive journey, that he would find not merely a suitable bride to satisfy his father's demands, but a genuine partner whose courage and honesty would reshape his understanding of what marriage, and indeed what love itself, could truly mean. Alina, for her part, looked at the man before her, no longer seeing either the frightening rumors that had once haunted her imagination, nor even entirely the humble, stable hand she had first come to know and trust. She saw, instead, simply Alexander, flawed and genuine in equal measure, a man who had gone to extraordinary and imperfect lengths to know her truly, and who had proven, through patient effort and unwavering honesty following that painful revelation, that he was worthy of the love she had offered him even before she knew his true name. As they turned to face their assembled guests as husband and wife, the winter sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the great hall, Alexander felt a certainty settle over him that no fortune, title, or arrangement could ever have provided on its own. He had come to this estate seeking to protect his family's future through careful, guarded observation. He left it instead having found something far more valuable, a marriage built not on duty or rumor, but on the rare and precious foundation of two people who had chosen honesty over disguise and love over fear when it mattered most.